Uh, Thank you, Mahlet. You have given a broad background, and I'm sure whoever is listening should already have an idea of what's taking place. I think, like you indicate, it hasn't yet been officially acknowledged by the AU. They claim that the US and the EU are interested in being observers in uh, in the peace negotiation between the government of Ethiopia with the TPLF rebels. But you know, what we are seeing, in my own perspective, in Ethiopia, let's assume because there is always no smoke without fire, and considering the fact that we have seen the EU diplomats, the US diplomats recently going and taking selfies with the TPLF in Tigray, it would all and then of course, like you indicate, the TPLF seems to be putting condition after condition in order for them to take part in the in the negotiations. When you look at all the things happening, it gives us a firm basis for believing that there should be a kind of plot to ensure that um, to ensure that the EU and the US get involved in these negotiations. But Mallet, this is not the first time that we see, you know, we see a sense of interference from the EU and the US in Africa, and perhaps to best understand the basis from which the EU and the US have always sought to interfere and to undermine the credibility of the African Union. A classic example takes us back to the Libyan conflict. For me, it gives us a classic model on how the US and the West treats the African Union. Let me give us a brief history, perhaps to lay a foundation for this. Number one, the shift. Let's first look at the AU itself, and then we can perhaps begin to see how involving the EU and the US undermines the authority of the African Union. The shift from the Organization of the African Unity to the African Union. You know the transformation. First, we were the Organization of African Unity, and then we became the African Union. Now, this shift was largely meant to give Africa a set of institutions and policies and organs that could provide what has now come to be known as African solutions to African problems. Now, this is the basis upon which the Peace and Security Council of the African Union was actually established. And the first major moment when we saw the Peace and Security Council getting involved in its mandate to manage and resolve conflicts in Africa was actually during the Libyan conflict of 2011. What happened back then gives us a clear idea of what's actually happening today in Ethiopia and how the West seeks to impose its own interests by undermining the processes that are being undertaken by the African Union. And I think I was taking us back to an example of how the OAU has always been undermined by the US and the EU to impose their own agenda on Africa. And I was giving us the example that before the AU it was the Organization of African Unity. Now, when you look back to the time of the OAU, it was more focused. I mean, it did not involve so much in conflict that takes place within countries. That's intra-country conflict. The transformation to become the African Union was meant to give Africa a set of institutions, policies, and organs that could provide us what has become known as African solutions to African problems. Now, just a quick one. At that time, we had, of course, Gaddafi was the president of Libya, and the West, the EU, the US, UK, and France had a rather bad relationship with Gaddafi. Now, when conflict in Libya, of course, broke out between Gaddafi and what came to be known as the National Transitional Council. That was around March, I think, of 2011. Now, when this conflict broke out, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union decided to meet. That was, I think, around March of 2011. Now, when the Peace and Security Council met, it arrived at two very important decisions, which once we understand them, will show us how the US and the EU at that time undermined the peace process in Libya, and how we can begin to see them undermining the peace process in Ethiopia today. Now, the first important decision that the Peace and Security Council of the African Union made was this: it established a roadmap through which the crisis in Libya could be resolved. The second decision that it made was to establish a high-level ad hoc committee that comprised 5 heads of state, who were then mandated to oversee the process of mediating the conflict between Gaddafi and the rebels, by then known as the National Transitional Council. Now, the committee, of course, had 5 heads of state. Now, all of this, by the way, was in line with the principle of finding an African solution to an African problem. By then, that was affecting Libya. Now, it involved 5 leaders of African countries. Now, the appointment of this committee demonstrated that the AU was determined to solve this Libyan conflict using African ways and using African leaders. But what was funny is that at around the same time, after this committee of 5 African presidents was formed, the UN passed a resolution which decided to impose a no-fly zone within Libya. Now, once this resolution was passed, the committee that had been set, this committee of the 5 African leaders decided to sit down and say, now we go to Libya and meet the two parties, Gaddafi and meet the rebels, and see how to mediate this process. Now, in order to do so, they were mandated, because by then there was now no fly zone within Libya. So they asked NATO to allow their plane to fly over to Libya and meet Gaddafi. When they asked for permission, NATO for this permission, they were denied permission. Indeed, the plane carrying, the media never talked much about it, and most people forget this. But what happened is that a plane carrying the 5 African presidents was stopped in mid-air and asked to reverse back to where it came from. Now, that thing was downplayed within the media, but you can imagine 5 African presidents flying on African soil to an African country on a peace mission, things in mid-air, and asked to reverse and go back to where they came from. That was the first time that NATO demonstrated a very high-level disrespect of the African Union, because these are people on this mission. Now, it is significant to note. Now, after some kind of consultation between the committee and of course NATO, they were eventually allowed, after I think a week later, to now, not actually about 2 weeks later, they were allowed to go back to now go and meet Gaddafi and meet the rebels. When the committee reached Tripoli and met Gaddafi accepted the roadmap, because they went the roadmap which was supposed to bring about the crisis to an end. It had about 4 points. Now, Gaddafi accepted and said, I'm okay with this roadmap. Now, after meeting Gaddafi, the committee left Tripoli and went to Benghazi, which was by then the base of the National Transitional Rebels. When they reached Benghazi, the rebels refused the roadmap. They said, we are not going with this. Now, what comes to my mind when we reflect it on the Ethiopian situation is that you have the TPLF refusing, giving conditions which make it impossible for the peace process to go ahead. The same thing happened, of course, at that time in Libya. The rebels told the committee that the only way that they could accept to take part in the peace negotiations was if Gaddafi was not part of the whole arrangement. Now, obviously, that was a condition that was almost impossible to meet at that particular time. But they still went ahead and gave that was one condition plus other conditions, making it almost impossible. They were giving preconditions and saying, for us to take part in these negotiations, Gaddafi must not be part of it, and so many other conditions, which basically meant that the committee and the roadmap could not go ahead. What I want us to ask ourselves here now at this point is that by then, Gaddafi was actually planning to send his army to Benghazi and to outrun Benghazi. And the fact is that Gaddafi's military was superior and could have crushed the rebels at that point. So what confidence did the rebels have in refusing a peace process that would guarantee their safety? Why would they refuse and say, we don't want this peace, we don't want this roadmap, when they knew that Gaddafi was strong enough to flush them out? What was the confidence? So you ask yourself, in the Ethiopian case, what is the confidence that the TPLF has in putting conditions which they know will make a peace process that is supposed to actually serve their interests well, but they are putting conditions which make this peace process almost impossible? But they know if they are left alone with the government of Ethiopia, they can be outrun in Tigray. I mean, we have followed the history of these battles, of the war since it began. We saw that the Ethiopian army was able to push them back to Tigray and could have actually followed them and annihilated them in Tigray, but they did not for some other reason. So why would these people who know that they're dealing with a government that is more powerful than them, that is the Ethiopian government, why would the TPLF that knows that they're dealing with a stronger military, begin to put conditions which make a peace process almost impossible? That was the same reasoning when I reflect back to the time of Gaddafi that the National Transitional Council rebels in Libya had in mind. Now, so what did the NTC have in Libya, these rebels? What was that? I want us to look at their mind and to begin to look at the mind of the TPLF, because it's the same mindset. Now, at about the same time that they were being asked to go for peace talks, the US, France, and the UK were giving similar conditions. It could almost be argued that the rebels in Libya by then were simply echoing the position of the US. Because by then, within the same time, the Cameron of the UK, then by then it was Sarkozy of France, and then Obama of the US wrote an open letter, a combined letter, and they said that the only way peace talks could, the only thing they could accept was Gaddafi first had to leave power before peace talks could go. And this is the same thing that the National Transitional Council rebels were able to emphasize. They said, unless Gaddafi is not there, we're not sitting down. Now, the rebels obviously knew that they had the backing of the US. They knew that they had the backing of France and the backing of NATO. Then at the same time, while the AU was trying to bring about peace and talk about peace and talk about negotiation, the NATO imposed a no-fly zone. Now, in this case, Gaddafi's hands were tied. You come back to Ethiopia and you're seeing that the same people who are saying, can you go to the table and negotiate, are the same people who are imposing sanctions on Ethiopia. Now, how do you then trust that you want these same people to be part of the peace process of the negotiation? How do you expect the government of Ethiopia to go for negotiations when they are going to have people who have imposed sanctions on them and people who are actually giving the conditions to be part of the peace process? Why don't we allow the African Union to oversee a process that they have started from the word go? It is the same mindset, disrespect for the African Union, and it is not beginning today. The moral of this whole argument, Mahlet, is that the West, which in this case would mean the US particularly, then the UK and France and their Western crony states, have no respect for the African Union. And for them to begin to impose themselves again, in this particular case in Ethiopia, and to claim that they want to be part of this process as observers, is actually an insult and another insult on the African Union. It shows a lack of credibility. And what they do usually is just about the same thing. They begin to discredit the African Union. Even during the time for Gaddafi, they began by saying that the committee of presidents who had been sent to mediate between the rebels and Gaddafi, were friends to Gaddafi. and could not be trusted. Now, if you cannot trust your fellow African president, how can you tell me that we should trust, foreigners? Because while these negotiations are taking place, the media keeps talking about how Obasanjo is it either is a friend to the government of Ethiopia. The whole goal is to discredit not just Obasanjo, but to discredit the African Union.